Hey guys, today I wanted to show you how I approach fixing mistakes whilst I am painting. Because in painting, no matter if I go in with a reference photo and it feels planned and intentional, there's always some kind of problem that I need to find or fix within the painting process or drawing process. And with this painting in particular, I came across quite a few problems that I had to solve whilst painting. And I wanted to take you guys along the process with me to show you how I overcame me making bad decisions, essentially. So the process starts with me just painting clouds. Now, clouds are weird. There are many different types, shapes, and shadings of clouds, but as long as you get the fundamentals right, then you can basically color your clouds whatever you want, and they will still look like clouds. You have to get the form right, though. So this is how I started the process. I first laid the sky color down. Wherever it will peek through behind the clouds, I wanted to get that color in because I am not going to be able to put it in as seamlessly after I layer on top of it. So I am also adding a slight gradient to the sky to add more depth as I paint it in. Now, as this part dries, I start to fill in the stone shapes that I have along the side of my painting with a base color. At this point in the painting, I am just trying to get my foundational forms and shapes in and basic colors in so that I can have a good basis to build the painting from. I am creating a fantasy-inspired sky pond and wanted the composition of the painting to include objects in the water to ground the pond, essentially. With the sky background dried, I lay down my first layer of cloud color. I'm using a mid-tone value and add light and shadows as I build for the future layers. Now, at this point, I'm not struggling. This is part of the process for me, and there's not a lot of problems that have cropped up at this point. I'm going for a more dreamy look, and we'll have pinky orange toned clouds. Now, as I add this layer, I'm very strategic with my shapes. I want this first layer to convey the overall composition of the painting. The shapes of the clouds will guide the viewer's eyes, so I want to be mindful where the shapes are beginning and ending. Now, as I wait for this layer to dry, when layering values like this, I find it more helpful to wait until each layer is dry before adding the next, or else it is easy to muddy the values you have worked hard to build. Because I am using acrylic paint, I don't have to wait too long though for each layer to dry. Next, I start filling in some values in the clouds. I'll piece in the shadows as well as the light, and as I do this, I'm also being mindful of sharp edges. Clouds rarely have very defined edges, especially since I'm going for a more dreamy aesthetic look. I want soft edges to the clouds. So you'll see that I use a mop brush to soften any lines or forms that seem clumpy or rigid. While this layer dries, I add a lighter value to the stones and give them some rough texture as well. Okay, now prepare your hearts. This is when things start taking an interesting turn for my painting. This next step might hurt some of y'all's hearts, but it's a part of the process that I enjoy doing. This is how I have learned to paint and how I enjoy painting, the process that I've chosen to use in all of my paintings, and it is basically building values, base forms and shapes and compositions, and then using very thin layers of paint to then color grade my painting, essentially, but with thin glazes of paint. So in this next step, I use Prussian blue and ultramarine blue mixed together because they are both semi-transparent paints. When you go about making glazes for your art, you want to make sure that the paint is typically not opaque. If you want a very nice glaze, you want it to be either semi-transparent paint or a transparent paint color, and usually those are the bright colors, and they will go on as lovely glazes that will tint whatever forms and underpainting you have built thus far. So as you see, I'm putting a thin glaze of these blue colors mixed together with some water, and I'll add this blue glaze over my cloud shadow areas. And I do this because I want to deepen the look of the clouds. Now, don't let this step frustrate you if you try this process, because it will feel like all of your previous work thus far was for nothing, and that is not true. All of the work underneath is building to your end product, and when you look at your end product, even if you can't identify the individual layers that you worked hard on, you will be able to tell that there is a beautiful seamless depth and dimension to your work. It will definitely be worth it. Now, after I add the glaze to the section, I will use a dry mop brush or 2-inch brush to spread the layers out and soften all the edges, thin the glaze over areas that I want it more thin, and push the paint more to areas I want to deepen with more color. Then I'll glaze over my stones with some color where the shadows are supposed to be. And this is the part where it starts getting a little tricky for me as I am planning my painting. I'm starting to think very hard about what I'm doing and be more intentional about each step that I'm putting in. I want the clouds to look dynamic, but I also want them to look blurry because of the water. And so as I'm trying to problem solve the aesthetic I'm trying to get, I'm honestly just playing around with techniques. What am I going to do to make this effect happen? And I try different things. The beautiful thing about acrylic and layering is that as I layer, like, nothing is ruined and everything is gained essentially. Now, after I have added and deepened the shadows, I will go in and add a layer of white acrylic diluted and start shaping out the highlighted areas of my painting. I want to create depth, and that means that I'm constantly going to be adding the darks and the lights back in, constantly adding the values back into my painting, because it will all become a mid-tone if you do not keep adding the lights back in and do not keep deepening the shadows. So be mindful of that as you build a painting if you try this kind of process or method. Now I will wait for that to dry, and as I continue, this is the point where I start getting dissatisfied. The clouds are not turning out the way that I envisioned them. And so I go in, they are two cool tones, so I decide to glaze over with a warm tone, which is a mix between Indian yellow and Naphthol red. And I make a glaze to go over to warm up my clouds, but then the values of the clouds, all the light is being dismissed and I need to bring the light back in, so I add another layer of light. And as you can see, through my constant adding and subtracting and moving and making this piece what I think it should be, you can see that I don't really know what exactly I'm doing, in the sense that I'm trying things to make things work. And as I keep trying, I am slowly getting closer and closer to the effect that I wanted to create, which is amazing. It's part of the process, right? So then after I let those layers dry, I've added back in the values of white and highlight and light. I go in with a purple glaze, and this was the moneymaker for me. This warmed up the areas that I needed warmed and brought the depth back in where it needed to go, and created such an ethereal, almost Renaissance-esque type of painting aesthetic, and I loved it. And so I kept going in this direction with my clouds. Now, as I finished up with the clouds, I started focusing my energy towards defining the stones and figuring out how I wanted the pond effect to work and show through my design. And this is the part that I got caught up on and spent way too much time trying to define the stones. What did I want the stone to look like? I had a couple of reference photos of actual stepping stones, but the issue was that it was becoming too dark. I was making the stones absolutely too dark, and that was a problem for me because the clouds were already darker, because I didn't want them to be the highlight because they are a reflection in a pond. So I wanted the stones to be the lightest part of my composition. But as I was trying to add more depth and detail to the stones, it just darkened them. And finally, this is what I decided to do to problem solve my stones. I decided to completely paint them white. And the reason why I did this, even though I literally lost an hour of shading and building layers, was because I wasn't gaining any of the light values back, and that was a problem. And so to solve the problem, I painted them all white to reset that part of my canvas. So after I painted it white, it was a little bit more smooth sailing. I decided not to go in and make very distinct shadows, but I decided to stick with a minimal detail for the stone cracks and texture. And a way that I problem solved this was I used watercolor pencils to then create texture without creating very defined texture. And how I went about doing this was with color theory. So I went in and started coloring different layers with different colors. I went in with orange, I went in with purple, I went in with blues to create this multi-distinct color palette within the stones that made them visually interesting, but not giving them distinct values, and kept all the colors very mid-tone, which helped me keep the stones the value they needed to be to stand above the clouds. After I finally got these stones situated, I felt like I could breathe again and was able to move on to the last leg of this painting, which was to create my little fox friend that was going to sit on the stones and be gazing into the sky pond. How I started about building that layer was I did a rough sketch of how I wanted his position, and then I blocked him in with color. So I realized after my first blocking in that I had made the fox the wrong shape. And so that was when I started reshaping him. I used a wet brush to soften the semi-dry paint that I'd already pulled down, and then I used a dry brush to scrape that wet layer, semi-wet layer of paint away on the areas where there should not be any color. And I reshaped the fox the way that I needed the fox so that his position worked. I think sometimes more beginner painters just put paint down and then they see that there's a mistake, but because they've worked hard to get where they're at, they just don't take the time to rework what they've done. And I think that that is just a simple mistake, but if they took the time to rework the forms before they build the forms up, then you spend less time disliking your work in the end. Now, I'm pretty adamant on what I wanted, so even though I did spend an hour on the stones, defining them and building layers, even though I knew that I would lose that time, I knew that I wanted the results that I wanted, and so I painted them all white. But not everybody will do that. And that's okay. That's okay. Just keep painting. You'll get better. So after I have the form of the fox down, I then go in and start piecing in values. Now, the biggest part for me that was a little tricky was the ear placement. The ear that is not seen in the outline of the fox because its head is slightly turned. So I knew that the ear would not look like the traditional triangle, but would look tilted and positioned where I would essentially be from a view where I only saw the top of the ear. Now, I kept the ear in the wrong position for a while, but I ended up seeing later on that his ear would not in fact be where I had it, and so I did just paint over all of it like I did with the stones, resetting it. Sometimes that's just the easiest way for my brain to reset and figure out a problem, is to just paint it white, have no regrets, and then go at it again starting from fresh, instead of trying to work with a pile of different mistakes that you've made along the way, and you just start back at zero. Now, afterwards, I start filling in the details of the fox. I know that this is going to be key because I didn't really detail anything else in the painting very much. I knew that the fox needed to have the most detail, which is a little difficult because it was quite small. And so I had to cut one of my brushes down so that I had a very thin brush so that I could put in some piece-like fur bits. Now, it really didn't start coming together until I grounded him with a shadow. And this is what I usually see in a lot of my work. If I do a person, or if I design a room and draw a place up, things don't start making sense to the human eye unless they have a shadow. And our brain intuitively knows that things must have a shadow to be where they are. And so once you can put a shadow down, I feel like that elevates a painting 100%. So that's what I did. I put in the shadow for the fox, and I felt like it elevated the scene so much just from a simple shadow. And then I put the shadowed reflection in the water surrounding the rock, and I feel like that elevated it that much more. I went in and added some more highlighted waves, little ripples around the stones, to give it more of a sense that there is a pond here and it's not just some weird cloud scene that doesn't make sense. So that is what I did. I then went for my final touches, got some pearlescent rose gold paint, and painted the ripples closest to the viewer. So the first 2 or 3 stones, I ended up enhancing the ripples with some rose gold paint, and then added detail to the fox to elevate it all so that when the light would hit it just right, you'd be able to see those particular objects and things stand above the clouds, which is what I wanted. So yeah, that's what I did. I tried to navigate this painting as best as I could, and I think I did a freaking good job. I could have made some bad choices or stuck with the bad choices that I made initially. I am glad about how it turned out in the end. I guess my biggest tip is to find out solutions to fix it when you notice the problem. Don't just wait for it to accrue and hope that it works out. Literally take an intentional step to change it. Figure it out. If it's a shape that's wrong, change the shape. If it's a value that's wrong, change the value. But think of things in terms of shapes and values. It takes a little bit of brain power and a lot of practicing the fundamentals, but it's fun. It's a fun problem-solving brain teaser. So yeah, I will see you guys in the next video.